Welcome to the March 28th meeting of the Implementation Advisory Committee. Going to start with a brief roll call. So it's going to mention your name and just say whether if you're here. Becca?
Yep, here.
Thank you. Marshall?
Here.
Roxana? Roxy,
Here.
are you here? Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you. James?
Here.
Beth?
Here.
And Kezia?
Here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm just going to take a note that Lung, Kari, and Lung said they won't be able to make it. Felisa, Terrence, that should cover 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yep. Okay. 10. Well, so today we have a two-part discussion. Both are very important. I think these are fundamental policies to the program. And actually, these are the final subcommittee recommendations that you all will be evaluating. Again, next week, we'll be talking about charter amendment and some other like stray policies, but these are like the final subcommittee recommendations for you to all to review. So we'll be talking about contribution limits, and then we'll be talking about in-kind contributions. And so, I think we'll dive into contribution limits first. And what I'm going to do is, of course, direct you to that folder where we have all the information in one place. I'm going to share my screen and just do like a very quick run through. I sent you the videos already explaining, how we get to the recommendation and what's involved in that consideration. But I'm going to do a quick run through if someone hasn't had a chance to watch them yet, or just to catch everyone up. So bear in mind with me as I share my screen. Let's see. I think I want to start with this one. Okay. So very first is the recommendation, and I'm just going to pull it up right here so you can see it all in one place. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. So before I start, I'm going to just say that the key things to keep in mind is when we're talking about contribution limits, we are talking about what the contribution limits that participants run under. These might not apply if candidates run outside of the program. So the city of Portland has a contribution limit for people who run under the program, and they have a different one for people who run outside of the program. So that's important to keep in mind. And then secondly, I would say that, the contribution limits are, we have a wide latitude on the contribution limits we set, but we cannot go higher than the Multnomah County Charters amendments. And the Multnomah County Charters amendments right now, their limits are $603 per donor if it's an individual or an organization, except small donor committees. They have, I think they're unlimited in what they can give, as long as they meet the county's definition of a small donor committee. So those are the restrictions. We can go lower than the charter amendment, we cannot go higher. But we do have wide latitude within that area. And then, of course, if the state law or county law changes with regards to the charter, this committee could certainly set different limits, but these limits are informed by those parameters. Okay, so first things first is the actual recommendation. It's pretty short, but it's 3 parts. Part number 1 is participating candidates cannot accept donations larger than $603 for any individual or political committee. So the subcommittee, decided to recommend that the contribution limits be the same as what they are in the charter. Number 2, participating candidates cannot, I'm just going to get through this and we'll open it up for questions. And I also want to give Marshall a chance to speak because he was on the subcommittee and might, have things to add here. Number 2 is participating candidates cannot loan or give themselves more than $603 to the campaign. Some programs allow candidates to give themselves a large amount or an unlimited amount. This subcommittee recommended that candidates are limited what they can loan or give to their own campaigns. And then number 3 is small donor committees are defined as membership organizations where no donor has given more than $250 in a calendar year. That is similar to the state's definition. So I think the intention here was to align this definition with the state. As I said in the video, there is some differing legal analysis about that question. I will talk about that in a second, but before we get to there, I want to give Marshall a chance to speak as he was a member of the subcommittee, and then we can start by answering questions. So Marshall, if you would if there's anything you like to share, and of course, not.
There we go. I got to turn my mic on. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Really not too terrible much more to add. Really the main thing that came out of our subcommittee was wherever possible to align with the state campaign finance changes that go into effect in 27. That's what we were trying to do. So, and just to try to standardize things as much as possible across all the things. I think it's a little bit crazy, and Kari felt the same way. If it was, if you have rules for Portland and rules for Multnomah County and then rules for the state, it gets really complicated, and it's hard for voters. It's hard for people actually running. So that's, most of the recommendations you'll see from our subcommittee were keeping things in alignment with the state.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that, Marshall. I saw some hands go up, so I think James was first and then Becca.
Yeah, not on content yet. I want to talk on content too, but just so I understand, when what was in the document is different than what you said, Daniel, and I wanted to see which one we're talking about, because in the document it says $603, but do we really mean no difference than whatever the applicable charter enforced dollar amount is? Because for next election that won't be $603, it'll be whatever it is, $650 or whatever. Is that what we mean, or do we mean we're fixing it now at $603 for participating candidates?
My notes actually say that I don't think the subcommittee clarified that, and so that's something that we should clarify here. That's a good point. Is for everyone else, the charter amendment allows for those limits to rise, due to cost of inflation. And so, it used to be $500, now it's $603. So when the county raises that limit for the next election cycle, do the limit for program participants stay at 603? Or does that also rise in conjunction? Is what James is getting at with that question. Becca, go ahead.
Thank you to the subcommittee for their work. I have a couple of questions. One is I appreciate what you were sharing, Marshall, about wanting as much alignment as possible. And I heard you say you were aligning to the extent possible with the state. That was a similar conversation that the in-kind subcommittee had. If I remember, and I was trying to pull up the chart, if we were aligning limits with the state, and in the state statute in 4024, it equates state legislative candidates to local candidates. That limit is significantly higher than 603, right? It was like $3,300. I can't even remember what it was. So curious about what the conversation and rationale is. That's one question. Second question is, the 603 recommendation applies to candidates who are in the program. What are then the limits of candidates who are not in the program? Are they significantly lower like they are in Portland? Or no, yes, I can't remember which way. Are they different? Is the question. And then the other question that I have, which might be legal, and maybe I'm getting this wrong, but participating candidates loaning themselves money. I had thought loaning yourself money, there was some constitutionality around limiting loaning yourself money. And so does the fact that they're participating in the program allow us to do that? I'm curious about the legal analysis.
Yeah, totally. I can answer the other two questions first. In Buckley v. Vallejo, which is a Supreme Court decision that really impacted public matching programs, they said that their local governments or governments cannot put limits on what candidates can donate to themselves. So that's the Supreme Court ruling. However, we are an optional program. And because we're an optional program, we have more latitude in the limits we can set. So, if candidates don't want to run under limits like these limits, they can run outside the program. So that's the thinking on that piece. The second thing is so under Portland small donor rules, their contribution limits for candidates who run under the program are $350. For candidates who run outside the program, they are going to be $613 in this cycle. For this county, what this recommendation is saying is that those limits are essentially going to be the same. If you run inside the county or inside the program or outside the program, they're going to be the exact same. And I think your third question was about why the subcommittee did not go higher or get close to the $3,300 that is allowed under state law. I think the question was directed at Marshall, if I'm understanding right. But if not, I can answer it.
If I remember correctly, and it's been almost a month since we had this conversation, I think both Kari and I were in favor of staying in line with the state. But Daniel, wouldn't correct me if I'm wrong, isn't that because we would have to go in and modify the charter on that? I thought we made that recommendation essentially to align wherever, again, the philosophy we both shared was align wherever possible with the state. But the 603 is like a hard number that we can't really do much with as this group. We would have to, we could send a recommendation to Multnomah County to put it on the ballot and see if that can be modified. But as it sits right now, that was about as good as we were going to get. And kind of the overwhelming, I know I feel this way, and I feel like Kari felt this way. Hate speaking for him because he's not here, but we want to make sure in this program that candidates have the money to run an effective candidate or an effective campaign. And I know personally, I feel like 603 is such a weird number. It makes no rhyme, reason, or sense, right? And they did a little bit better job with the changes that are coming statewide. But to have a little bit more latitude to give folks some freedom to get some larger campaign contributions, and not spend every single second of their campaign out trying to get money, right? Campaigns shouldn't be about fundraising alone. They should be about reaching the voters. So, and that was just kind of the theme. So Daniel, feel free to add anything to that.
Yeah, that was good recounting what the subcommittee was thinking through. So the state law says that if local governments have set limits lower than the $3,300 allowed for a candidates for the legislature, if they set them lower than that as of January 1st, 2024, which this county did, then it can keep those limits. So the state allows for us to set limits as high as 3,300, but the county charter says that we have set limits as 603, and the state law allows us to keep that in place. So we cannot go higher than 603 unless there was an amendment to the charter or a change to state law. I think before we get into the content of the discussion, I do want to give a very brief overview of the other documents here. Not going to take a lot of time, but just want to make sure I've covered this one. I want to make sure I cover the other ones. So Becca, do you have a technical question or do you have a content or a philosophical question?
I mean, that's an interesting distinction. It's probably both. I actually have a series of questions related to the recommendation around limits. So if you need me to wait, I can wait if you wanted to go through additional stuff.
Yeah, let me just do a brief overview and I might answer questions or might spark more questions. So we talked about the limits, of course, already and the recommendations. I'm going to direct your attention over to this fact sheet. It's called the contribution limits fact sheet. And this goes over the core information that the subcommittee was reviewing. So it includes everything we talked about here. Multnomah County has a 603 limit. Here is how they define these limits, and takeaways from the conversations too. The notes we have from subcommittee members are written in red. And then you scroll down a little bit further, you can see these are the rules of different localities too. And I have a chart in another spreadsheet, which I'll show you in a second. But you see areas that have asterisks next to them are jurisdictions that are around the same size as Multnomah County. And this is how, yeah, I can put this in the link. And this is how, you know, localities that are that size are setting their contribution limits. Let me just pop this in a link real quickly before proceeding any further. Okay, that should. Okay. So these are what the limits are in different jurisdictions, so you have a sense to compare them to. Scrolling down a little further, this is what the Portland limits are. And, you know, as we said, 350 for candidates running for office. It's the same for candidates running in all offices. It doesn't matter if you're running for auditor, mayor, or city council, the limit's the same as 350, and that's done for simplicity's sake. They have this seed funding mechanism over here where candidates can raise more at the start of their campaign, but only up to $5,000 total. And they can take loans up to $5,000. Again, we cannot set that unless there's a charter change, unfortunately. We have a little less and I say unfortunately just that because we have a little less flexibility in our program to set rules like this. And this is the Buckley v. Vallejo decision about candidates donating to themselves we talked about earlier. And then this is some data I have here on Portland's program and other programs that set lower limits. The candidates who run for Portland mayor usually have, as you can see, a large number of donors. And then that's versus the candidates here who run for county chair, they have a far fewer number of donors. So if part of the goal is to get candidates to engage with more people, then, that gives us a comparison or like something to shoot for. And we do partially achieve that because we have this tiered system where candidates have to reach more donors in order to unlock more funding. And then, I think this is a New York City study that puts two systems side by side. It looks at candidates who ran under public matching. They had lower limits, but also the matching funds. And then candidates who ran for the state legislature, they had higher limits and no matching funds. And you can see the comparison of how many people are engaged in each system. So for candidates running for state assembly, again, higher limits, no matching. This is how many everyday people were engaged. And then when you compare it to people running under matching program with low limits, this is how many people are engaged. Because where you set the limits influences how many donors candidates have to talk to. And then in here we have this is taken from the Portland City report that came out, I think, in 2020, and there was another one in 2022. We said, how many of you have never donated to a candidate before? The vast majority, or I shouldn't say the vast, the majority of donors had never given to a candidate running for city office before, and they did in 2020, partially because a matching system with lower limits encouraged candidates to reach out to more people. And then you can see the geographic distribution here, where, before the program, most of the donations were coming from this area of the city, and then that spread out more once we got to a matching low limit combination. So that's everything in here. The final thing I'll show you is, I'm just going to jump over here real quickly. Now we can get this part of the thing out of the equation. Share this tab instead. This is a visual representation of where the Multnomah County limits are if they were set at 603 versus other localities. As you can see, they are on the higher end of the spectrum. And that's what I want to underscore here is I'm sharing with you this information because I'm not trying to contradict what the subcommittee is saying. I think the subcommittee put a lot of thought into this recommendation. I will say though that the limit being a 603 does set us pretty far out from the norm, as you can see in this chart. And so I think it is my job to explain why a lot of communities choose lower limits. Not saying that you all have to or should. I'm just explaining that these are the dynamics, so you all have that information in your heads. So that is the charter. I'm sorry, that is the comparison here. And then two more things I'll show you is this shows the percentage of small donors who gave less than $50 to candidates who ran for county office. And this first one's chair, the second one's county commission, and the third one's sheriff. Small donors take about a third of the number of donors that candidates have. But you compare that to Portland, where their limits are a little lower, and they have the matching program, and small donors make up a far higher percentage of their their donor pool. And the last thing I'll show you real quickly before we get back to the discussion is this shows you what would happen if Multnomah County adopted a $350 limit like the city does for its matching program. What would that mean for candidates fundraising? So on average, the bolded numbers here represent the percentage of the amount of the percentage of the total they raised from donors who gave over 350. So if you put a limit in 350 in place, the campaigns would lose that much money. Of course, they're gaining the matching funds too, but it's important to understand with private donations, this is how much they would lose. So we have that math in front of us too. So with all that being said, I'm going to bring us back to the conversation. I know, Becca, you have some initial questions. Would you still like to ask them?
I would.
Yeah.
And some of them were just to better understand the conversation that the subcommittee had. I fully appreciate, and I think we've all said consistently that consistency matters, whether it's, aligning with the city or the state for kind of ease of compliance. What was the rationale behind trying to get to the state limit as opposed to aligning with the city's limit is the first question, which I think will inform the next question.
I think both Kari and I, and again, I'm speaking for someone else here, but we both felt that the way the city of Portland's first go at small donor elections went was pretty shoddy at best. And I know my personal experience with candidates, and I dealt with well over 50 of them in the last race. Many of them struggled because of the low limits. And that was just a message I took away from the candidates from the real world. And Kari felt very similar in that. So there were a lot of folks out there that are very well good intentioned, but at $5 and $10 a pop, you're just that's not enough money to run a campaign. And when the funding mechanism failed, it wasn't 9-to-1. It was, oh, here's this bucket of money. We're just going to give you a little bit of money when we get to this point. But it really wasn't enough to do everything that was needed to run the campaign. So I personally do not feel the city of Portland is even remotely a model that should be followed for anywhere else. That's my personal opinion.
I appreciate that context. And, implementation of policy is one thing in terms of people's experience. I feel like it doesn't necessarily discount the fact that some of the policy is good. Having the limits be really high in a matching program, you talked about $5 and $10 contributions. To Daniel's point where he showed like the lower the limits, the more people contribute. And the more honestly voice folks who are low income have compared to someone, like $10 is going to be more meaningful under a low limit matching fund program than a higher limit matching fund program. So that I struggle with that a lot in terms of having it be a higher limit than the city of Portland. But I'm super curious. By the way, I have to switch to my phone because I have to drop my kid off at track practice, but I'm listening. I would be really curious. And Marshall, I appreciate you sharing your experience working with candidates. But I think Kezia's on the call, would be really curious to see as a candidate if the Portland limit felt limiting. I mean, I know it's supposed to be limiting, but if it felt like prohibitive to success.
Well, thank you for calling that out. Since I was not in the small donor program, I know I was close to it and I wasn't in it. So I will say from some of the things that you just said though, Becca, I think, it's seeing the other jurisdictions and what that has meant to participation, I think is really impactful to have the lower limits. I think that to me is something that is a very important piece. But I do think that the city of Portland, the way that it was structured was first go round at trying to do something, and there were some failures. And so aligning with the state maybe is a better model if we're looking to do some alignment. But I do like the New York visualization that you had that was impactful, Daniel.
I think James, your hand's been raised.
Yeah, I had two things, I guess, to just kind of add to the conversation. I'm excited, and thank you, Marshall and Kari, for your work on this. And I'm excited to discuss it and think through it with everybody today. I was recently thinking about our charter for this group. Sorry, hold on. Ignore the phone call coming in. I was thinking about the charter for our group, and I went back and looked at it, and I feel like part of it speaks to removing the reality or the perception of big money in our politics. And I was thinking about the work that we've done so far, and so far we've really just been adding, more money in through public matching and through other things. And I feel like if there is one place where we're going to be kind of making the case to Multnomah County voters and taxpayers, like, hey, we want to reduce the role of like big money or reduce the role of folks who can cut larger checks. This feels like the place where that, like, we would do that. So I wanted to throw that in. And then the other piece is the original City of Portland program matched up to $50, I think 6-to-1 or whatever on $50. And then as part of their post-cycle analysis, they looked at, well, who's actually giving, $50? And they found that it's skewed wealthier, whiter. I'm kind of remembering this from several years ago, but like older, more male, like it's skewed towards all the demographics that have usually had an outsized role in elections. And so that's why they made the choice to like use a lower dollar amount, because in other places, like, as you ratchet down the dollar amount, then you see the participation expand across more groups. And so I'm just kind of wondering about how we want to factor those considerations into what we recommend here.
And before proceeding, I'll just let people know. So the City of Portland used to have a limit of $250, and then it raised it to $350. And the City of Portland used to have a 6-to-1 on 50 match, which means that $50 donation resulted in $300 in matching funds. It then changed that to a 9-to-20 match. So a $20 donation resulted in 9 times that with 180. Okay, Marshall.
There we go. Yeah, I just wanted to say kind of a couple things there. I hope I didn't lose my train of thought. I think kind of the thoughts in the subcommittee on this whole process is, the big money in politics that I feel like most people complain about is not the $50 or $100 contribution that's out there. It's Phil Knight rolling in and dropping $5 million in the governor's race, or doing numbers that honestly, a Bitcoin bro running for Congress solely funding his own race, right? I mean, those are the things that put being in politics out of reach for everyone, right? They really do at the end of the day. And we can't stop the Bitcoin bro because of the Supreme Court, but that's just, I think the perception of having this type of a program allows us to, even the playing field. And I think what everybody needs to remember, realize we're setting the limit, and what the subcommittee was talking about, keeping it where it was at the 603 and adjusting for inflation. That limit still doesn't stop somebody from giving $5 or $10 or $15. And where we set the tiers to get matching funds was based on number of folks that were contributing. So a $20 contribution really does mean as much as a $600 contribution at the end of the day, when you're talking about numbers to get you to that next big pot of gold. So don't forget that when you're reaching out to all of these folks, that yes, it does matter. That $5 contribution is still important. So just things to consider.
And so I will, want to continue this conversation. I just want to put a flag in it. We should have a formal consideration about whether or not we want the limit to adjust with inflation or not. So we'll just have to come back to that. James.
Yeah, thanks, Marshall, for much, for that response. I guess as somebody who's helped with, campaigns that have both participated in small donor programs and not participated in small donor programs, I think it often as a campaign, in my experience, folks are kind of leaning into like, well, where can we make the money that we need to make in order to, pay for staff and do the other voter outreach stuff that we want. And if somebody, can get $603 at a house party from a single donor instead of $5, then that's a big difference. And then people are planning, their house parties in wealthier communities where they're expecting that folks can give $603, and that doesn't go away if, we put a limit like the city of Portland at 350, then folks are, trying to throw house parties where people can throw $350 or can give $350 a head. But I mean, like the more that is, condensed, the more it means that folks are participating, or trying to plan their campaigns around all the neighborhoods in Portland or in Multnomah County, and not just like the ones that can cut the largest checks.
Marshall?
Yeah, and that's totally heard, James. I what you said just kind of brought me back to a discussion that we had in this committee with Kari, and it was, we wanted to be really mindful of not driving people to the independent expenditures. That was the other part of this. And I do agree with you. Yes, you will still have house parties with the $600 voters. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I also think in this model, you're going to have house parties with people that can give you $5 and probably big parties where you can bring people in, because again, you need numbers to get to those big pots of gold. But if you keep those limits down too much, I think we keep pushing folks further and further away towards independent expenditures. And the reality of it is that campaigns cost money to run. TV and media ad buys are not getting any cheaper. And if we don't give campaigns the resources to go out there and actually get some of their own media and have their staff and do the things that they need to do to get their message out, at the end of the day, then what we see is a bunch of independent expenditures. All you have to do is look in Washington and look at their races up in Washington. All they are independent expenditures, because the limits up there for where you can give are so far more drastic than what you see here in Oregon. And that is a far less transparent system than what we have here in Oregon, where Orstar tracks everything and you see all of the different campaigns. You can know right where the money's coming from and who, and it just becomes a lot more vague when you get out into the world of independent expenditures. And that was a key discussion point that we had in this, is we don't want to inadvertently create a market of, oh, look, let's just go to independent expenditures to do everything.
Becca. Becca? Becca, I see your hands raised, but I think you're on mute. Okay. She might be in transit right now. Want to make sure that everyone has a chance to engage with this. Oh, Becca joined again. Okay. Hey, Becca, can you hear us now?
I can. Sorry, I lost coverage for a minute there.
No worries. I see your hands raised. Did you mean to raise it?
I did. I have some questions and then some comments. I wanted to follow up on what Marshall was saying around independent expenditures. I feel like we all share the goal of trying to limit them. I am curious because it's been my experience on the independent. You had talked about Washington. I think that's true for like state legislative and statewide. I don't know if that's true for the city who has the voucher program. And so maybe this is a question for Daniel, of since they have their voucher program, which has lower limits to participate in, have we seen independent expenditure? Have we seen an impact on independent expenditure activity for city council races? Is the first question. And then the second question and kind of a comment is, we're talking about limits in kind of isolation. I mean, we talked about the numbers to get to unlock matching, but, and forgive me if we've done this in a meeting that I wasn't in, or even in a meeting that I was in and forgot, but we haven't talked about the match, right? Like 9 to 1 on, you know, up to how many dollars. And so I think, are we setting those? Are we leaving that to the independent oversight committee to set the match because it might be budget dependent? I think that also has a significant impact on the conversation around the limit in general.
Yeah, so there's actually, so what the IAC has voted on is that there actually will not be a ratio multiple match in our system. Our system is going to be a flat tiered approach. So when you get to these many donors,
right.
it unlocks this much money. When you get to these many donors, it unlocks this much money. So there's no need to go through and do a ratio multiple match on ours. With the question about independent expenditures, I don't have data on Seattle, but what I can tell you is about Portland's experience. So Portland has seen independent expenditures both with candidates who run outside of the program and candidates who run inside the program. And so, you know, not to pick on anyone, but like Mayor Wheeler, when he ran for re-election in 2020, had independent expenditures come to his aid when he was running for that seat. And he did not run under the program. And then I think most of the major or the top performing candidates who ran for mayor in 2024 who ran under the program also had independent expenditures. So independent expenditures existed for people who run inside and outside the program. I will say for the mayoral candidates in 24, part of that was because the program did lower the matching amount that it could give out to candidates running for mayor. It was used to be able to give them out like $250,000 or $750,000, and it dropped it down to 100,000. So I think that's part of the reason why a lot of the Portland mayoral candidates had independent expenditures, you know, on their behalf. So that's what we know from Portland's experience too. Becca, do you have more questions?
Yes, and I can't believe I forgot the policy that we actually voted on, and I was part of. But thank you for the Portland background around independent expenditures. Two things I'll share is, one, just having been in conversation with organizations who were engaged in the Portland election, who engaged in independent expenditure work. A lot of that didn't have to do with the amount of money candidates could raise. It had to do, or could not raise, it had to do, I think some groups would have preferred to have done direct coordination with the candidate and been out in community with the candidate, but the rules around in-kind were so difficult to interpret and to comply and to report. So I'll just offer that as maybe a teaser for the conversation around in-kind, about if we're able to kind of open that up and have it be more clear for folks, then I think it will have an impact on independent expenditure activity. And there's something else. You know, going back to the kind of where do we want to equalize influence and power, I do think, you know, lower limits, again, allow for a $10 contribution to be more meaningful with higher limits. It also impacts the recruitment on the front end of what kind of candidate would choose to get in the race. I mean, if you're a candidate who has friends who can write $500 or $603 checks, I think it's a lot easier for you to, even with, you know, and, oh, I get some public dollars, great. I think it's a lot easier for you to make a decision to take the risk and run for office. As we all know, it's a huge, big sacrifice, than it is for someone who may have, you know, deep ties in the community and lots of connections, but most of the folks they've been organizing with or working with can only give, you know, $10. So it's not only how does it impact candidates once they are declared, but it has an impact on who would even potentially choose to run.
Thank you for that. I think just to frame it up for everyone else, so I think the discussion now is between, you know, the subcommittee has recommended contribution limits at 603. And then we're hearing from, also that some folks feel like that's too high and they want a lower contribution limit. Just to make sure we're engaging everyone, the folks who haven't talked, like Roxana, Beth, and Kezia, how do you, where do you all fall in that like paradigm? Kezia.
I wanted to be formal. I raised my hand. I mean, the way that I'm starting to, like I'm just tracking on what's been said, but I feel like if we are trying to have some equalization, I do feel like having the lower limits makes sense because we do have the numeric, incentives of getting donations of really any increment to be able to unlock the dollars. And so that will achieve funding for candidates. They just have to put the rigor into it, which has its own set of considerations for those that have very busy lives, and it may be difficult for them to be able to carve out the time to do the fundraising and, to get to the multiple donations that are required to unlock large amounts of funding to be a competitive candidate. But I don't really see a way around doing that. So I think a lower limit makes sense to me if we're trying to get more participation and more representation.
Okay. Beth.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think I would be much more aligned with having the lower limits. I think to James's point earlier around house parties with aiming for $600 donors versus $300 or whatever that limit might be, I think that will drastically impact the accessibility and equity that we are like integrating into the system. And I would always strive for it to be as equitable as can be. Obviously, elections are never going to be fully equitable. There's going to be ways that big donors can still donate big. But as much as we can limit that and, make it as equitable, that's generally what I'm going to be in favor of. And I think that lower contribution limits aligns with that.
Yeah, before we get to Becca, I just want to make sure, Roxana, if you have anything to add, that you're welcome to, but also like no problem if you are just in listening mode right now.
Sorry, are you guys able to hear me? I'm at work. So
Yeah.
no, just gonna throw this in quickly that yeah, I totally agree with Beth. I'm all about the equity, and also like what Kezia said, I absolutely agree on the lower limits because of that incentive. I think that it will get the funding that we want from the candidates or for the candidates. It'll just bring more participation because of the lower limits.
Okay. Thank you all for sharing. Becca?
A question and then maybe a comment, and now I'm going to feel like I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth. One is, if we set a limit, in reading the recommendation by the Oversight Committee, are we allowing them the opportunity to come back and revisit that limit? Because it'll be in code, right? This isn't, so I guess that's the question. I mean, I'm just thinking about what Marshall has said a couple of times and what we all know to be true, which is it's really expensive to run a campaign. And I also worry about, thinking about the current budget condition of Multnomah County. There's a real reality where there won't be money in the small donor program to actually provide resources for candidates to run a real campaign. And so that's the thing that's, I'm all for lower limits. And if the county does not have the resources or is unwilling to invest the resources needed for a small donor program, then the limits are really, really significantly limiting. But Daniel or folks, do you all have a answer to my first question around?
Yeah.
Does the oversight adjust?
Yeah, definitely. So these would actually be set in code. And code as in like the county board would adopt these as part of their law. And so that is, when last week the IAC met to discuss Oversight Commission and the administrative rules that they would have. I think the administrative rules that they would delegate to the Oversight Commission do not include setting the contribution limit itself. They can, but I think one other thing that we did discuss in the subcommittee was, to Becca's point, there is, if the program is I think for the city of Portland, if the program is underfunded, the Oversight Commission has the ability to raise the contribution limits. And it has never used that ability, but it does have the ability to do it. And so that could be like a good, middle ground option too, is if like the county does not fully fund the program to allow it to give out the matching funds that you all have requested, then maybe the Oversight Commission could be able to raise the contribution limits and make up that gap too. Marshall, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you guys both kind of hit on a couple of points there. If you remember back to our first meeting in the budget presentation, Multnomah County is not looking good fiscally going forward. And I feel like the numbers that we've put in our benchmarks, we put them like probably a little Pollyanna high in terms of what's going to really be there. And also remember with this, that the 603 is already in the charter. So it would have to go through that process as well. So, and I think all of that came out in our subcommittee idea was that, this is an established amount. It does help raise funds that are not necessarily dependent on the county. I get all of the equity arguments. I really do. But I go back and look at what City of Portland did when they promised all of this money to the candidates and they just flat out didn't deliver. And that ruins some folks' chances. I'm not really sure how equitable that is at the end of the day when you're promised something and then it's stripped away from you. I think that's a totally different story. So that's my perception on it. So I'm not for changing that number. That's that from our recommendations. So there you go.
Okay, Beth.
Totally hear you on that, Marshall, and thank you for sharing. Totally agree that if the program isn't able to deliver the funds that were promised, and that is a structural issue within the program. I do think the idea that you brought up, Daniel, around having lower limits, but then also having a caveat in there that if the program isn't fully funded, those limits can be raised. I think that's a really good, I feel like that could capture a lot of those issues that we are worried about right now. But I also would be really curious to hear other people's thoughts on it who are a little bit maybe more well-versed in contribution limits than myself. But at its forefront, I do think that idea sounds pretty good to me.
Okay, yeah. What do people think about that specific idea? If like the program is underfunded, it cannot provide the matching funds, that are enshrined in law, then the Oversight Commission has the ability to raise the contribution limits. That I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. Becca, I see your hands raised.
Honestly, I think we should do that regardless of whatever limit that we land on, because it will be a reality. I have a question, and I'm sorry, maybe it was restated when you originally kind of prefaced the recommendations, but if the small donor program participant limit is 603 and the charter does not change, then what would be, if you're not participating in a small donor program, you have the same limit. I'm just thinking about what is I guess the incentive is public dollars, but when the city of Portland set the limits different, right, allowing a higher limit for folks who weren't participating in a small donor program and a lower limit for people who were, what was the rationale for that? I can assume what it is, but what was the rationale, and what are we missing out on if we equalize the limit for folks in and out of the program?
Yeah. Okay. So just gonna hold the original idea that, or the original question that Becca's saying, that it might be wise to just give the ability for the Oversight Commission to raise contribution limits regardless like whether or not you all set the limits at like 350, 603, whatever, the Oversight Commission should be able to raise them if there is underfunding. So Becca, do you mind if we put your other question on hold for a second while I just explore? I just want to make sure like if there's consensus on this one thing. Okay, thank you. Marshall?
Oh, I was just going to answer Becca's question from the subcommittee's perspective, but we can take care of the other business first if you like.
Okay. Okay. And then let's see here. So James and Kezia, how do you feel about that proposal that Becca brought up?
I'm in agreement with it.
I don't know how I feel about it. I mean, it's interesting. On the one hand, I actually think that the Oversight Committee, as part of kind of an ongoing review, you know, at the end of each cycle, they should be assessing like kind of what worked and didn't work. And if they find that, you know, the limit needs to go up or down, in some way, I kind of want them empowered to, you know, make the program run as effectively as it can. I'm a little bit hesitant about the idea of like, oh, if the county underfunds the program, which could be, you know, we've asked for $5 million. It's like, if they underfund it and they only give $4.5 million, or, you know, I mean, there's obviously a big difference to me between they underfund it to the tune of $4.5 million, which, you know, we estimated how many candidates we thought were going to run. Like, it's possible that has no impact on any candidate who's actually running, but the program is still underfunded because they've given less than what we said they should. You know, I'm hesitant to like, oh, the program's underfunded. You know what we need is to increase the power of the wealthiest donors. You know, like tell all candidates, oh, stop hosting your $5 house parties and switch to hosting $603 house parties. Like, I don't love that as like, that's the escape valve for our program if the county underfunds it. Because I do think, you know, to everyone's concerns, I think it is likely that the county will underfund it at some point, you know, over the lifetime of this program. And I don't know. I don't love the idea of our solution to that is like, oh, we want to give you public dollars, but also have you go court the like wealthiest donors, just like the non-participating candidates.
Okay. And Roxana just texted me saying that she had to hop up, but she can hop on to do a vote later on. So, you know, please stay on if you're able to. Becca.
I just wanted to reflect on what James mentioned, which kind of got to my question earlier. I'm also interested in how folks feel about giving authority and opportunity for the advisory commission to make changes up or down, right? To evaluate, as James said, to evaluate the program, see what's working, and beyond what the administrative rule authority that we're giving them. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it also is important to put that in an independent body. There's something else I was going to say. Oh, the other thing is, and again, so sorry, I feel like I'm playing my own devil's advocate, but I was just thinking about Multnomah County's future budget processes. There will be times in which the budget will dictate that they will have to underfund. I'm also wondering if we say like, oh, we can just raise the limits if you underfund, if that inadvertently gives the Board of Commissioners incentive to underfund, right? Where they can just be like, oh, they can make it up on the other end because they can just raise the limits. So, sorry, none of these questions are easy, and they all have like implications. So I feel like, you know, we got to explore every rabbit hole.
Yeah, you know, I will say that the oversight, if you have a rule like this, the Oversight Commission would have the power to raise the limits if the program is underfunded. It doesn't mean that they have to. You know, they can certainly decide that they want to, you know, that there's enough matching programs that candidates can still raise sufficient amounts with, you know, the existing limits. Or they could, you know, they feel like the board's trying to force them to raise the limits. They certainly don't have to do that. So it's just empowering them with that ability. Beth.
I also have to hop off right now, but similar to Roxanne, if you need me for quorum for a vote, you can shoot me a text and I'll try my best to hop on again.
Okay, thank you.
We're ready for the discussion.
Yeah. Okay, Becca, I think your hand is still raised. Okay.
I don't think it was
Um,
meant to. Can you remind me again, for the city of Portland, it's 350 small donor. What's the limit for non-participants
it will be $613 in this next coming cycle.
for city of Portland?
Yes.
Okay. So it's the same amount as the county.
The county is 603 and the city is 613, but it's pretty
Oh
close.
my God. Okay.
It's because they were enacted 2 years apart and they were both set to rise by inflation. So
Oh
you
my
know, they're
God.
they're slightly off, even though they both started at $500. Yeah, the question that you asked before, Becca, about like why the city is the way that it is. I mean, I was involved in some of the like initial, small donor stuff at City of Portland, and I do think that like many of these programs nationally, the idea is for a candidate, if you're gonna get access to this like public money, you're kind of giving something in exchange, which is, like I'm gonna like target my, donor base to be not just the like top tier or whatever. And so that's like part of the, usual rationale for why there's like a higher limit for non-participating candidates than for participating candidates. The idea isn't just that the government is like, trying to shower people in public money. There's like a real different like campaign strategy for folks who think that they, like will be successful by head count versus folks who think that they will be successful by like high dollars.
Okay. So I think let's continue the conversation because Beth and Beck and Roxy can come back. So hoping that we'll be able to hold a vote on this today. And want to leave some room for talking about in-kind donations. I texted Felisa and Terrence and asked them if they could join. I haven't heard back yet. But they both RSVP'd yes on this. So there might be a crisis going on for them. So I think I'm hearing that like some folks are wanting the limits to stay at 603, which is what they are for candidates who run outside the program. It's the highest they can go for the charter. Reminder, we cannot go higher than that unless there's a change to county law or state legislative law. So some folks are wanting to keep it at 603. Some folks are wanting to lower the limit to a lower amount. Before I think like why don't we talk about that before I do think we should revisit the question about like does the Oversight Commission have the ability to raise contribution limits, but let's like put that on hold for a second. So in discussing the limits, just to like make sure we have two ideas, for folks who want the limits lower, what limits sound right to you all? And not saying that we're going with these, I'm just trying to like be able to like set up a choice for people.
I mean, honestly, oh, go ahead, Kezia, sorry.
Thanks, James. I wouldn't even know honestly where to start. I think I'd want to be looking at comparable cities that are utilizing the system with lower limits and having success. That to me seems like a reasonable approach. Otherwise, it would just be sort of a, thumb in the air to sort of figuring it out.
I will say that we do have that information, and it's on this tab I'm about to share here. It's on the contribution limits fact sheet. It does have the list of limits for different localities, and the ones that have asterisks on them are the ones that are the same size, around the same size as Multnomah County. So, like Denver is $595 for mayor, $235 for council. Baltimore is just $250 across the board. And San Francisco is $150. And the city of Portland, remember, is $350. So that's where these set their limits. If people want to go lower, and again, I'm not saying that we're doing that. Just trying to like set that the choice up for folks. If people want to go lower, how do people feel about the $350 limit that the city of Portland has for its small donor matching? Becca.
It's interesting that you shared a jurisdiction that has different limits for the mayor and city council, because of course the chair's race is more expensive than the commissioner's race is. But the
Mhm.
city, it's flat, right? It's 350. The mayor doesn't have a higher.
That's correct. It's everyone's the same limit in the city.
I know this doesn't answer your question, but I need to think about it. But I just wanted to state this is one of the times when I really wish we had a more robust engagement process, because I feel like it'd be great to talk to, other candidates or other organizations or other voters who had an opinion or an experience. So it feels weird. I mean, I'll just speak personally for me to make a recommendation. I guess I don't know if I'm prepared today to make a recommendation, but I don't know. I may get there. I'm also driving in my car and I feel very uncertain making big decisions when I'm trying not to run into the person in front of me. So
Please don't. Yeah, and like we will be having, I know it's a weird order of operations. I do want to emphasize the folks that we will have a community engagement process. Like the idea, just because of like the time limits we have, the idea is to have the recommendation report finish and then go to community groups and give them something concrete to then like offer their feedback and assessments of too. And then bring all those to the board for the board to take a vote too. So it's not an ideal situation, but there will be community feedback built into the process too. Marshall, I think you had your hand raised.
I did. Yeah, and I'm just going to throw this out there. I guess at this stage of the meeting, it feels a bit disingenuous to try to be coming up with a number when less than half of our committee is here and half of our recommendation committee is here. I haven't felt super comfortable speaking in Kari's place today. And he had a lot of really good input on this subject when we went through this. He's really knowledgeable on such things. I know this has been a challenge, and I've spoke up on this in the past about attendance with people in this group, but to me, it just doesn't really sit right to try to come up with a vote on this today when, we're calling people in to come in for 2 minutes to vote on something they haven't even listened to the discussion on. It doesn't feel right.
Okay.
I kind of agree, and I think this is like one of the most important things, and I mean, as we've experienced today, maybe one of the most controversial. So it seems hard for the four of us to have a great conversation and then just call two people in to, hey, will you vote with us? Like I got it with Marshall.
Yeah, I think okay, so like let's brainstorm a little bit. I think we have a little bit of extra time, but I mean we don't have that many more days before the report is due. So there does have to be like an end stop on this. I think what we could do is have the discussion further on Friday. I don't know for sure if Kari's going to be able to join for that meeting. But we could have that discussion on next Friday and try to come to a place of consensus. How do people feel about that? Support. Okay. I'm assuming most people are saying yes to that. Okay.
4 out of 4. This is like the most agreement we've had on anything.
There you go. Okay.
Can I ask a timing question? I know so much of this is driven by the deadline. I know this was the charge that the Board of County Commissioners gave. I can't remember if it came, along with the budget for this effort. I'm curious if I know that we wanted to give them a number to influence the budget process because obviously that is moving. But is there any flexibility to go back to them and say, like, we actually need more time to be more thoughtful and engage more people in these recommendations?
I think the board feels that, or at least the chair office feels that if the program is to be launched for the 2026 election, then there needs to be time for developing the administrative rules and bringing together the new oversight commission and then like implementing and communicating about that broadly. And so, and of course, like, and I think, you know, developing any other, you know, hiring more people, you know, for staff, or whether or not there's like a reporting software component. So the thinking is like to allow enough time for that to occur. And I think the timeline has like 6 months on that for those pieces to come into place from like July through December. So if it's coming up to, and I think then in that case, if it's hoping to move into the next phase in July, then you would still need a couple of months ahead of time for the board to craft the policy and do, and for the county to do community engagement. So I think that's why like we have a date set to give a presentation on May 6th to the board. And that would, I think they would have 2 months from that to then like develop and vote on a policy. And then they could start the next phase, which is those other pieces that I talked about too. So I don't think there's like honestly that much that much cushion space to allow to to keep, I think like to stretch this out further. I think like if we went like another week, I think that's fine. I think that's doable. But I think beyond that, I do think that we do have pretty clear instructions to have that report due by, I think, like April 22nd for then, which is like part of a 2-week process where like it's due by April 22nd. And then that way, like it is, submitted to the board 2 weeks before the vote, which is our normal practice too. But we can absolutely push this vote to next week if people would rather, if people feel more comfortable in that. I don't want to feel like people are rushed on that one. Like it gives maybe folks more, everyone's got access to the documents. It gives folks more time to like explore those numbers and like think it through and, try to think about like if there's a compromise there too. Okay. Let's, since we're all on this call, can we transition and talk about in-kind donations too? And we don't have to have a vote on this, but that way, I think the initial thought a few weeks ago was that when we don't have quorum, the IEC can at least like do a conversation and find consensus and see if like there was like a quote vibe check. And if there was, it can like craft a policy and vote on that later. Since we have you all here today, and again, we are on this, like we are in a time frame, can we begin that discussion about the in-kind donation policy? Do people feel comfortable with that? Okay. Okay, great. Then I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, and I'm going to move over. So bear with me for a second because I want to show you all the in-kind donation information. And if folks want to like get water or go to the bathroom, like by all means, this is a perfect opportunity. Okay. Ready to dive in unless people like want a little more time to take a break. Okay. Well, so I'm gonna bring back this this slide on the overall recommendations. Again, all the recommendations are written out here. You're all welcome to review these. The qualification thresholds are done, in-kind donations. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to dive right into it. I think everyone here knows what in-kind donations are. So the subcommittee, in essence, decided to make a recommendation for a in-kind donation policy that is virtually identical to the state law. So when 4024 was passed in the state legislature, and that goes into effect in 2027, it detailed what in-kind donations were allowed and under what circumstances. So the in-kind subcommittee put forth a recommendation that is virtually identical to what the state has already passed. And the goal is to have a consistent approach for organizations, campaigns to understand, how to work within in-kind donation. And so that way it's the same rules, pretty, closely the same rules for the state and the county. And again, these only apply to people who run under matching programs. The core of it is that the subcommittee authorizes, it said like individuals and organizations can give in-kind donations. Organizations can give them. However, most of the donations have got to go to things that engage into direct voter engagement. That'd be community organizing or direct voter engagement, like canvassing, knocking on doors, phone banking, etc. So you can see here, section 1 says that organizations can donate up to 1 full-time equivalent staff if the staff is limited to activities that organize people, such as direct voter contact, community organizing, community outreach, staff support for direct voter contact, community organizing, community outreach, administrative support, and it gives the administrative roles the ability to define those a little bit further. That's very similar to what the state has. So in this one, organizations can give those items, but it has to be as a staff member. So like an organization will put a staff member on a campaign to work on community organizing or community outreach. It cannot give over, for instance, it cannot like make a website for a candidate or, buy ads for a candidate. It's more limited in what they can give, and it has to be through the lens of staff time. It also says membership organizations cannot donate staff time if the staff member are employed as pollsters, campaign consultants, and campaign strategists. So, and they have been in the last 18 months. That again is part of state law. And so what that's saying is that organizations can give those 1 FTE full-time equivalents for those items that we just talked about, but it can't be donating like a pollster or a campaign consultant because those are particularly high value donations. I mean, like those typically cost campaigns a lot of money, and those don't necessarily engage more people in our democracy too. So that's why organizations cannot give, staff time if it's for pollsters, campaign consultants, and campaign strategists. The organization must be solely responsible for the pay and benefits, employment status of the staff member. And then when donating staff, the membership organizations can donate an amount equal to blank months of full-time staff equivalent. The legislature, the laws in the state say they could donate up to 12 months full-time staff equivalents. So whatever an individual makes in their 12-month salary, if they make $100,000, for instance, that would be the amount that the organization can donate to the candidate.
Just to clarify on that, it's salary plus benefits and stuff.
Yes, yeah, apologies, thank you. And the reason that's blank is because there was not actual consensus on that. So we'll circle back on that in a second. Membership organizations are allowed to donate the following items. And again, this is the same as the state. Transportation costs up to $2,500, food and beverages up to $2,500, small gifts incidental to the operation of the business up to $1,000, office space that does not exceed 2,500 square feet, and the lease is for less than 12 months. So these are some core functions that campaigns just need help with. These are pretty low limits, 2,500, or whatever the value is of that office space. And they were, I think the in-kind subcommittee felt that these were not like corrupting influences, but they do help campaigns function. And so, I highlighted this because it made me realize maybe we should broaden it from membership organizations to small businesses too. Because, if a restaurant wants to donate $2,500 worth of food, should they be able to do it? Under this current recommendation, they would not, because they're not a membership organization. And most of the time when campaigns get office donated, it's like from, they have a friend, the candidate has a friend who's an attorney, or the candidate has a friend who is, maybe a realtor, and they have some extra office space and they want to donate that. They would not be allowed to under this, because it has to be a membership organization. So that's why I highlighted that. Maybe we should think about that a little bit more. Services for items are not subject to in-kind donation limits, as in there's no limit for what organizations want to give for these items. And those are childcare and elder care that's connected to campaigning, translation interpretation services, legal services connected to campaign finance issues. So, that is meant, the reason that's unlimited is because that's a question of access. There are people who want to go to campaign events, or candidates themselves or campaign staff who need childcare. And an organization being able to donate that allows those individuals to engage with the campaign. Campaigns can accept in-kind donations before and after they qualify for the matching funds. So in Portland's programs, candidates can accept in-kind donations from the very start when they run, all the way up through the end of the election, because it takes a long time to get enough donors to qualify for matching funds. And in those 6, 7, 8 months, campaigns still need help. And so that's why in-kind donations are allowed before matching funds are qualified for. So these, I just ran through the rules real quickly. Again, they're mapping on really closely to what the state is. Before we dive into these two highlighted sections, what are people's reactions to these? Or are there reactions to the recommendations? Kezia says, fine, makes sense. Okay. Marshall?
Yeah, no real issue with any of it.
Okay. Becca and James, you all were on the subcommittee. Do you want to we'll talk about the highlighted sections in a second, but in terms of what else is in this provision and the fact that you want to match it on the state law, do you all want to explain or talk about, the thinking behind that? Or any values you want to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main value, which Daniel did a great job covering, was trying to this, to Becca's frequent statements about, it being really hard for organizations to engage if the rules are different in different jurisdictions. And I mean, in overlapping jurisdictions, especially, but in jurisdictions that they're, involved in multiple campaigns. So really trying to keep some consistency here with the state law, which we felt, the three of us felt, was pretty good. I mean, spoke to the values of broadening democracy, and that if we're going to allow larger contributions to come in, that it's really got to be focused on how do we bring more people into democracy, which is the focus of much of that. I can't remember exactly how we landed on the office carve out. I think that's either in state law, or it's no worse than what's in the charter right now. I don't remember what the deal is with that. That is a potentially large source of a large donation, but all in service of how do campaigns get in front of actual voters.
Thank you. Becca, anything you want to add?
No, I think both of you covered it well.
Okay, great. Let's take on the highlighted sections. And again, we don't have to have a vote. We're just trying to see if there's a way we can find consensus on these. Let's start with the maybe potentially easier one. So this provision is similar to the state. And it says membership organizations are allowed to donate transportation costs, food and beverages, small gifts, and office space. My concern is that a lot of times when campaigns raise, or need office space or need food, they actually often go to small businesses. And so they'll go to a restaurant and ask them for some food or beverages, or, they will, they'll go to like a friend who has some office space and ask them to donate. And again, these aren't, I think the subcommittee didn't feel like these were like corrupting influences in general, and they have like low limits in place. So I was worried, I think like if we do change it to small membership organizations or small businesses, or say any organizations allowed to donate the following items, that might really meet the need that campaigns have to get and how they often get those items. How do people feel about that though? It would be a difference from what the state law is. Becca.
One is I have a question for folks who are engaged in conversation about the state law. Was there a reason why this was specific to membership organizations and did not include businesses or other organizations? That's a question. And the other thing is, I don't remember us, and James, correct me if I'm wrong, when we were looking at all of the limits, I don't remember us having a conversation around membership organizations and how to define them. In state law, they have a very specific definition. It's, you have to be tax exempt. You have to have members who are active and take an action every month. So I realize in looking at this, when we have membership organizations called out so specifically, we haven't had any conversation around how we would want the county to define it. Yeah. Generally speaking, like I need to think about it for a minute. What you said, Daniel, makes sense. Why would we be so limiting to membership organizations? But I also don't know what the conversation was and if there was some real reasons.
Okay.
I think transportation costs up to 2,500 means if you're including more groups in that, that's effectively just saying if you would prefer to give 2,500 and call it, transportation related instead of whatever the other limit is, $603 or, 300, whatever, like another limit might be. So I think a number of things on there doesn't feel, candidates will have $2,500 in transportation costs. So that is something that effectively anyone could potentially give. So would not want to open that up further than, specified in state law. Food and beverages, I hear what you're saying. I don't have a great sense for what the difference between $350 in donated food is from $500 or $2,500. My sense is for a lot of the like fundraiser stuff that I've never run a 600 person house party or whatever, but I've run 100-person house party and the food costs were less than $350, and so it feels like the regular limits might work for the average business donating food. Now, the office space, maybe we should like revisit that. Office space, I hear you, that like that's something that a campaign only needs once, so it's not as though they're getting it from their 10 richest friends. It feels different than the other things. And the small gifts, that's like cash. Like we don't want to open that up. Just because you're a jeweler doesn't mean you should like be exempted from giving jewelry to the campaign, right? So that small gifts when it's membership organizations is like t-shirts, like whatever. You want to give an SEIU t-shirt to the candidate, like fine. No more than $1,000 of t-shirts. But yeah, office space, I think maybe we should talk more about, but the other ones I would want to keep as limited as makes sense at the state.
Okay. I think I saw Becca first and Marshall.
Oh, I'll wait for Marshall because I've already talked.
No, thank you. I just actually wanted to talk real briefly about the food and beverage, and actually I agree with that amount. And I'll give you a really good example, James, of in the Portland City Council races of an event I wanted to do and couldn't. And so all I wanted to do was open up my labor hall which we don't charge to rent out to labor unions. And I wanted to let all of the candidates that we had spoken to come in and put up a table. And I wanted to invite all of the people that worked in labor unions through the AFL-CIO to come in and visit with these candidates and get to meet them one-on-one. And, like if you've ever run big fundraising events, the one thing that loosens up people's pocketbooks a little bit is you give them a glass of wine or two. And so if you throw a little bit of alcohol in there, $2,500 goes really, really quickly. But I got to be honest with you, you can't tell me much more of a democracy building activity than what I had proposed, and I couldn't do it. Flat out could not do it. And I thought it was absolutely asinine that I couldn't do anything like that, where I couldn't support candidates directly as an organization because of the small donor limits, but I couldn't hold an informational meeting and supply food and drink because it was outside of the bounds of what the in-kind donations would have allowed. So I am fully in support of what I see under membership organizations over there, because that does allow campaigns because there are organizations that don't have small donor committees, it allows them to still help and build democracy in different ways.
And I think the question is like, how would people feel if it was not so much the contribution limits themselves, but like, how do people feel if it wasn't just membership organizations that can give those things, if it was also like businesses or LLCs or, sole practitioners who could give those things too? Becca.
I mean, just reflecting on both what James and Marshall have shared, there are some things I think I would want to limit to membership organizations, and some things that might make sense to open it up, like office space and food and beverage, for a local restaurant to in-kind a meal to folks. And if we do that, again, back to the consistency, are we causing more confusion and potentially causing a difficulty for a small business who, thought that all four of these things were, they were able to in-kind and then get into trouble because they gave them $250 worth of, Starbucks t-shirts.
Mm.
I don't even know if there's such a thing. I do not want one, but there might be.
It's not on our budget. And so I think, that's a good question. Like, if it's a little different than the state law, is that going to be confusing for people? Personally, my feeling is it wouldn't, because it's actually simpler. Any organization could give these amounts, or more organizations give this amount, and so like that's less of something that organizations have to work through. But I mean, maybe people feel differently. Maybe people feel it would be too confusing to walk away from the state in this way.
I guess in general, my philosophy is that membership organizations are special. I mean, membership organizations represent, a broad base of people. Sole practitioner represents like my rich dentist, or whatever. Like it's one person. Whereas a membership organization, especially, and appreciate Becca's comments about like, how's that defined? I think I was picturing we're adopting the state, definition, but we'd want to, if we're thinking something different, then we're back to philosophy club and we'd have to think through like what we want. But for simplicity, I do think I was picturing the state definition, and under that definition, membership organization is like, hey, you've brought all these, electricians together and are trying to act, politically as whatever, 3,000 electricians, not as like one business. And so because of that, we're kind of giving you these, limits that are higher than are afforded to other types of organizations, because you're working to broaden our democracy through your membership.
Okay, Marshall.
Well, kind of a two-tiered question on that. So for number 5, it was the intent that you could do all of those things, or 1 or 2 or 3 of those, or they were all up for, so essentially you could do, quite a bit of money on that, right? That was kind of the philosophy. Okay. And then my second question was there any conversation about doing an in-kind printing? Because there are member organizations, UFCW comes to mind. They have their own in-house printing services where they're able to print campaign flyers for candidates, and not all member organizations have those resources. Was there ever any discussion or idea behind allowing a dollar amount to help with something simple as a mailer? Again, that's a campaign expense. It's something that's helping get the word of the campaign out to the masses. To me, that seems like a bit of a no-brainer, but that's always kind of been my philosophy on in-kinds.
You know, I want to let room for James and Becca to speak on that question. I will say, like, I think my recollection of the conversation was that the subcommittee members wanted to, again, replicate the state law, and also, you know, felt like it should really be focused on like these democracy building activities that are more about community organizing and direct voter engagement and like human to human contact. Is I think what the subcommittee said. Becca and James, is that right? Okay,
Yes.
I'm getting-
Sorry, I was
okay.
busy cutting and pasting the definition of membership organizations. Yes, and if I remember correctly, does the city of Portland like expressly prohibit printing?
Yeah,
It does. Although, like, if it's their definition of a small donor organization, they are allowed to print, but up to $10,000. And it has to be directly provided, as in like UFCW can do it, but other organizations can.
Yeah, and UFCW does meet the definition of small donor, even under the city of Portland's rules.
Totally. So going back to number 5, I'm hearing some like folks say they are comfortable with membership organizations being the only ones who can give some of these items, but there's openness around maybe the office space as being able to come from like a sole practitioner or, you know, business. Is that right? Am I reflecting that right?
I mean, I think maybe I opened the door to be like, oh, maybe other people, and now that I am, and maybe a couple of other things, and I think both for consistency, clarity, purpose, and also because I agree with James that membership organizations are special, right? As defined, they are special. They are, you know, folks coming together. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I am, even though I began this conversation open-minded to adding folks to it, I think we should keep it the same.
James Marshall, how do you feel about that?
I'm okay with keeping it as it is. I guess I would have 2 questions on that. Like, and maybe these are even not even this isn't even the right place to ask the question. I probably have to ask Secretary of State, but like, how in the world do you in-kind transportation costs? Do I give you a bunch of gas cards? Do I mean, honestly, like, do I pay for your Ubers? Because every contribution I make, I have to record with the Secretary of State for its purposes. I like that. This is what always blew my mind with like what the city of Portland had come up with, is it's like, I can't write a check for a lease somewhere for somebody, or I could give you space in my building potentially. So I could see where that might work out in certain instances, but transportation, I'm trying to even figure out how you would go about tracking that one. But as far as leaving it as it, I'm fine with that.
Okay.
I think we want, because I mean, looking at that, you could easily have almost $10,000 worth of stuff there. And I do think and of course I'm biased in this because I am part of a membership organization, but there's certainly a difference. You know, I represent 6,300 electricians, you know, and we come together to form and try to get political views passed. You know, same thing with UFCW and SEIU. They're all the same types of organizations. You know, so I do think there should be slightly different rules than just 1 or 2 people for those folks.
Okay. I think you know, to answer your question, I don't know in depth how the Secretary of State defines transportation costs. I think, you know, this recommendation allows room for like our oversight commission to establish definitions. There you go. Perfect. So Becca, thank you for putting that in the chat. Okay, and James, just to round it out, and Kezia, do you all want to keep it as just membership organizations that can make these kind of donations?
I think
I think
that's
that I'll just say I think membership organizations are it's fine leaving it as it is. I've heard the rationale and it makes sense hearing the explanations.
Okay, James, you feel the same way? Okay, great. So I will remove that highlight. And then we only have a few minutes left, and I think hopefully we're gonna get through it all today, but I just don't think we'll be able to. So the other thing is that there was a different opinion around the amount of time for a full-time staff equivalence, or actually like what the value of full-time staff equivalence was. So, under this recommendation, and under state law, if I am an organization and I have a person who, I pay $100,000 to, and that's their year salary, including benefits and, any other cost, that if I wanted to put them on a campaign to do these kind of community building organization or things that we talked about before, the organization can donate up to $100,000 and as the FTE. So there was some disagreement about whether or not that was too much. Is $100,000, or not $100,000, but like if there's currently no monetary limit on this. It's just the amount of equal to FTE of whatever the months are. And so the subcommittee debated whether or not to what there was a monetary limit on how high that could be, or what if it wasn't for 12 months, but if it was for a shorter amount of time, which would actually lower the amount of the gift. They did not reach consensus on it. And so I think like they asked that the full IAC, evaluate this. We're not the full IAC today, but just wanted to get people to start thinking about this and hear some initial thoughts. I hope I captured that right. Becca, I saw your hand raised.
You did capture the conversation correctly. However, I think we were all incorrect. Not incorrect, but applying apples to oranges. Just in going back and looking at the statute, it says you can donate up to 12 months of FTE per year. And for state legislative candidates, for example, that includes 2 elections, right? A primary and a general. Because the county is moving to one single election with RCV, I don't know how far apart we will be. I feel like there's a willingness to not have it be 12 months because there's only one election.
Oh, okay. Interesting. James, any thoughts as a subcommittee member that you wanted to add on to that?
Well, I guess I did want to kind of make the case. So City of Portland reflects this as a dollar amount, and there was some work as part of passing the update to state law to move to more of a calendar amount a calendar length or whatever, and that is to try to not decrease, to not put a downward pressure on wages. So the idea is organizations who are availing themselves of this at the state level are already going to have to report the hours that are worked. So that system will be in place for organizations to report to the state, presumably through the ORSTAR update. And so then this feels like a better way, if you're if your organization is able to pay your direct voter contact, community organizers a higher wage than competitors, we shouldn't say, oh, you can only have them spend less time on we're advocating for the candidates that you care about. So it seemed like doing some kind of measurement of hours instead of dollars was a better way to do it. So just wanted to make sure people knew why we had landed on that.
And so you say hours, you mean hours or months?
Well, sorry, it'll be reported in hours, I assume.
Oh, I see.
It will roll up to 12, months at the state level or whatever.
Okay, gotcha. Kezia.
I was curious about the membership organizations donating the full-time equivalent staff. Is there a limit on how many how is there a limit on how many membership organizations can do this? That's question number one. So like you could have 5 or 7 membership organizations that if we arrive at a month amount of like, 6 months of FTE, staff help, you could have multiple membership organizations that would participate. That's what I'm thinking. Is that a scenario that could play out?
There is no limit in this recommendation on the number of organizations that can give. But each organization is limited to 1 FTE.
And I will say, Kezia, it's complicated.
Yeah.
The City of Portland's small donor matching program originally had kind of an aggregate, as a candidate, there was a limit on how much like of this in-kind support that you could accept. And it makes it really complicated because, there might be 5 organizations that want to support you. And it's like, oh, only the first dollar, like only the first one of you can do it, And so if your organization has a slow endorsement process or, whatever, even if your like treasurer is slow to cut, checks or, this isn't a check thing, but like, you can see like there's a real problem if you do an aggregate, limit, which in some ways is nicer, but it ends up to be like a huge administrative hassle that the candidate isn't always even aware of how to navigate. The organization might have said, hey, we're sending you, this money, but if you get it after, you get a check from some other organization, how are you supposed to handle that? It's a real headache, which is why things have moved less to like an aggregate limit on what the candidate can accept and more to like, okay, well, each organization, you're limited to this amount, which is part of why, since a candidate could be accepting this type of support from a bunch of organizations, that's part of why, for me personally, something like, the original proposal of 12 months felt like way too much. I mean, you could get that from 5, organizations. It's more than staffing a single campaign for county seat.
Yeah, and I think if you're trying to get to something that is like an equalizer, then you would have to not only identify the limit of the months per membership organization, but then the number of membership organizations. I don't want to over-engineer anything, but I think if you don't, then you very well could have, 10 membership organizations giving 6 months each, and that's maybe not what the intent is. There may be some candidates that just have that kind of success and they really have a built-in advantage. Other candidates will, lag behind not having that kind of support. But I don't know if that's the intent is to get us to have sort of an equalizing effect.
I think, the conversation was, if I remember, was really mostly focused on how to reduce confusion by finding that consistency with state law. That was like the number one value. I mean, there were definitely other values discussed too. But no, that was part of it.
Well, Daniel, I don't want to throw a wrench in anything and have it be complicated, but it's just something that jumped out at me. It could be just a total outlier and it'd be like, okay, everyone's going to get like 1 or 2 people or whatever that are going to come from membership organizations, and we're going to max it out at 6 months worth of FTE time, and maybe that will be how it plays out.
Okay, Becca.
Just a couple of pieces of reflection. I mean, one, just as a practical matter, there aren't a whole lot of organizations who could effectively lend staff to something other than their kind of assigned duty. So I don't, and also if we have a bunch of organizations whose staff are involved in democracy activities, I think that's an awesome thing. And not only would it be complicated, but if there's a candidate who appeals to a wide variety of Multnomah County residents and has a supportive community-based organization and a business association and a union, those 3 entities who under the definition would all qualify as membership organizations should be able to work with that, candidate and support them in a coordinated way rather than an independent expenditure.
Okay, so Becca, it sounds like you're saying that you're not in support of like a limit on the number of organizations that can, is that right? Okay. Marshall, James, what do you think about that question about should there be a limit on the number of organizations?
Well, I think Kezia and I have like some kismet or alignment on like recognizing that this is a potentially like election changing amount of support depending on where we put the, limit. And I'm interested in like that there's not a, power center who can always kind of create the election results that they want by pouring in whatever resources that is. So I'll start there where I think I'm in kind of alignment with the Kezia's value. But I do stick to like, I think administratively, it just doesn't work to say, here's a, aggregate limit on the amount of time. So, I mean, because of all, so Union 1, files their hours, and then Business Association 2 files their hours who support the same candidate. Like, what happens when you are at the limit? Like, who has to like undo the hours that they've donated? Like, I don't think that there's a practical, like a good practical way to do that. And so for me, the way to achieve that value that I think I share with Kezia is like to have like a lower, overall amount. And I think I was throwing out the number like 2 months, which is, I mean, it's hard to like get these numbers exactly right, but using the numbers that my subcommittee colleagues were throwing out, that would put the dollar range roughly in like what the city of Portland allows. Like the dollar range at 2 months would be like roughly $10,000 limit for a single organization. And that feels to me like something really significant that campaigns would be very motivated to try to get. But it doesn't feel like a single, organization or 2 or 3 organizations who work together could completely shift the trajectory of the election with that.
Okay, Becca?
I mean, given that we were trying to align with the state, and the state is 12 months, but the state contemplates 2 elections, I think I would be more interested in a 6-month limit. And I mean, when James, you're talking about a 2-month limit, which equals $10,000, I think you're contemplating a salary level that not all community-based organizations can achieve. And the other thing I would say is that the city of Portland was contemplating, and I'm assuming they will again, their committee is increasing their in-kind amount. So I would be interested in potentially a 6-month, but I also know that we don't have a quorum. So it's probably something we want to bring back to other people.
Okay. Marshall?
Yeah, I think this is something I'm going to have to noodle on a little bit, to be honest. I guess I can really see both arguments on this one very easily. It seems to me that if we set it too high, the potential for abuse is way, way, way too easy. The flip side of that is what's the actual enforcement mechanism to that. So if you claim you have a chief of staff that makes $100,000 a year and I write you $100,000 check to cover their wages, then do you hire an assistant at $90,000 a year? And I've just given, you know what I mean? I mean, there's like, you could dump a lot of money into a campaign really, really quickly. So I don't know. I do think there needs to be some kind of guard in there. And I think something to remember, when you're looking at membership organizations donating this money, there's a lot of them out there that can do a reasonable amount, more than the 603 that we're talking, pretty easily. That's not uncommon because remember, these membership organizations are made up of a lot of people. That's kind of the whole point of them. So, I think having a reasonable amount in there that you can still make a difference and help that campaign out. I don't know. But like I said, I'm probably going to have to sit on this one for a little bit.
Okay. Becca?
Can I ask a clarifying question? Because what you just said, Marshall, is leading to confusion for me. I read this as an organization can donate staff time equal, like your $100,000 political director can work on the campaign. They can't. This isn't cutting a check.
Right. That's
Okay.
correct. Because it actually says here the organization is solely responsible for the pay, benefits, employment.
Yeah.
Of the staff member.
Okay, you could
Um,
have like organizers, knocking doors with the candidates campaign. You could have like a data person helping them with their database. But again, they'd have to be employed by the member organization, and that organization would track their time, and it couldn't exceed the.
Well, so
Right.
so let me give you just a brief example to see where that could be problematic is, let's say we have a race coming up. Construction has slowed in Portland right now, and organizing in general is we don't generally organize a lot of people in from the non-union when there's not a lot of jobs to send them to. So I have a staff of 6 organizers right now that don't have a ton of work. But let's say there's a really important race coming up, and we take 2 of those full-time inside wireman foremen at benefits that put them at a ridiculous amount of money per year, and we send them out to a campaign for 6 months, and that the value of that is going to be really close to $100,000 each. That's not certainly equitable, and we couldn't do that all the time by any stretch of the imagination. And I think probably the intent of this is probably far closer to we're going and knocking doors on the weekends kind of a deal, right? I mean, but the flip side of that could be something different too. So I don't know. And again, I don't even know if there's a right answer to that, to be honest with you, Becca. I really don't.
Well, listen, thank you all. I'm sorry that we briefly had quorum, but we couldn't hold the whole time. I do think that this was good conversation, and I think some members we definitely I heard people voice that they wanted other members here for that conversation. So I think definitely something let's keep thinking on this, and then on Friday we'll come back and hopefully get some resolution. Hopefully have time to talk about charter reforms, or charter amendment. But we actually do have one other week built in. I was going to give you that week off, but if we are needing more time, we do have that as a contingency option too. So I think we can still keep track on the timeline. But thank you all so much for the conversation, and and please let me know if you have any other questions.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
All
Have a
right,
good
enjoy your
weekend.
weekend.